Have you ever felt judged because of the way you looked or dressed? Imagine walking into a place, excited about what you might find, only to be dismissed because you didn't look like you belonged there. In the heart of the city, nestled between towering office buildings and luxury boutiques, stood LaBelle Motors, a high-end car dealership renowned for its collection of the world's most opulent cars. The dealership was a sanctuary of wealth and status, where polished Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Bentleys lined up in a glittering display of extravagance. Each day, sharply dressed salespeople, wearing custom-tailored suits and gleaming watches, awaited their elite clientele with eager anticipation. The atmosphere was one of excitement and competition, as each salesman vied for the attention of every high-profile buyer that walked through the glass doors. But on one particular morning, the rhythm of this luxurious bubble was disrupted by an unexpected visitor, Henry Marsh. Dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn jeans and scuffed shoes, Henry's entrance was met with skepticism and side glances from the staff. His modest appearance seemed almost out of place amidst the grandeur. Henry's steps were slow, deliberate, as if savoring each car he passed. His eyes, filled with quiet curiosity, scanned the showroom with genuine interest. He paused in front of a sleek red Ferrari, admiring its design, before moving on to inspect a shiny black Porsche parked in the center. Despite his clear fascination, it wasn't long before the sales team began whispering amongst themselves. "What's he doing here?" muttered Rick Thompson, one of the senior salesmen, his expression a mix of disdain and disbelief. "Probably lost," another quipped, chuckling under his breath. None of them considered for a moment that Henry could be a serious buyer. After all, what business did someone dressed like him have in a place like this? But while the others scoffed, one salesman noticed something different about Henry's demeanor. Jake Palmer, a young recruit still finding his footing in the competitive world of high-end car sales. Unlike his colleagues, Jake wasn't blinded by appearances. He watched as Henry moved from car to car, lingering longer than a casual passerby. Ignoring the disapproving stares of his co-workers, Jake decided to approach Henry. "Good morning, sir," he greeted warmly, extending a hand. Henry looked up, surprised, but a small smile tugged at his lips. "Just looking around?" Jake asked casually, his tone free of judgment. The older man nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the cars. "I've always loved cars, but it's rare I get to see so many beautiful ones up close," Henry admitted softly. Jake's genuine interest in Henry's words caught the attention of Tom Reynolds, the dealership's manager, who stood by the glass office at the back, arms crossed, frowning deeply. "What's Jake doing?" Tom grumbled, narrowing his eyes. "Wasting time," Rick replied dryly, shaking his head in disbelief. "That guy couldn't afford a set of tires here, let alone a car." But Jake paid no mind to their judgments. He continued to converse with Henry, asking questions, sharing stories, and treating him with the same respect he would a billionaire buyer. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, Henry's eyes lighting up as he talked about his love for classic models and his fascination with modern designs. Their exchange was interrupted when Tom stormed over, his expression thunderous. "Jake," he barked, glaring at the younger salesman, "we have paying customers to attend to. Stop wasting your time on this gentleman." The word gentleman dripped with sarcasm. Jake hesitated, glancing between his boss and Henry, who now stood awkwardly, his hands shoved into his pockets. "But, sir," Jake began, but Tom cut him off sharply. "Now," he ordered, voice low and menacing. Jake swallowed hard, his jaw tightening, but he didn't move. Instead, he turned to Henry and offered a tight smile. "I'm really sorry about this," he murmured, voice strained with genuine regret. Henry held Jake's gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, unassuming business card, and handed it to the young salesman. "If you ever find yourself in need," Henry said quietly, his eyes soft but firm. "Don't hesitate to reach out." Jake stared at the card, stunned, unsure how to respond. Before he could say anything, Tom stepped forward, practically shoving Henry toward the door. "Have a nice day," Tom snapped, the false politeness doing little to hide his anger. Henry didn't protest. He simply nodded once to Jake, then turned and left, his footsteps echoing softly in the suddenly silent showroom. The room buzzed with murmurs once Henry was gone. "What a waste of time," Rick sneered, shaking his head. "You've got to learn, Jake," another salesman chimed in condescendingly. "Time is money. Don't waste it on people who clearly have none." But Jake wasn't listening. He stood frozen, staring down at the business card in his hand. There was no name, just a simple phone number and a small note scribbled on the back. "Kindness matters more than you think." The words resonated deeply with Jake, leaving him with an unsettling feeling that he couldn't quite shake off. Something about Henry's quiet demeanor and humble gratitude seemed to linger in the air long after he left. From that day on, Jake found himself thinking about Henry more often than he liked to admit. He caught himself glancing at the card during quiet moments, wondering who the man really was and what his story might be. But with the pressures of the job mounting and Tom's constant scrutiny bearing down on him, Jake didn't have much time to dwell on it. Still, something in his gut told him that Henry's unexpected visit was more than just a chance encounter. Little did he know that small, seemingly insignificant interaction would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever, testing his character and resolve in ways he never imagined. As the days turned into weeks, Jake continued working at LaBelle Motors, but the encounter with Henry weighed heavily on his mind. Despite being a relatively new hire, Jake had quickly gained a reputation as a diligent, respectful employee. Yet the fallout from that day seemed to hang over him like a dark cloud. Tom's eyes were constantly on him now, scrutinizing his every move, waiting for any sign of disobedience or hesitation. One afternoon, as Jake was in the middle of showing a client a Mercedes, he felt Tom's gaze boring into him from across the showroom. He swallowed hard, pushing the discomfort aside, and forced himself to focus on the customer. But when the deal fell through, something entirely out of Jake's control, Tom seized the opportunity to humiliate him. "You're too soft,
No wonder
Jake,"
you wasted
Tom
time
growled
on
in
that
front of
bum.
everyone. His
You
voice
don't have
sharp
the
and
killer
cutting.
instinct
To close a real deal. The other salesman chuckled, their laughter grating against Jake's nerves. He stood there, fists clenched at his sides, fighting to keep his composure. He wanted to defend himself, to tell Tom that kindness wasn't a weakness, but he knew it would only make things worse. Instead, he bowed his head and muttered an apology, his pride stinging with every word. Afterwards, he found himself standing outside the dealership, staring at the business card Henry had given him. The note, "Kindness matters more than you think," seemed almost mocking now. Jake couldn't help but wonder if he'd made a mistake that day, choosing to stand by his principles instead of playing by the cutthroat rules of the business world. But before he could dwell on it further, Tom stormed out of the building, his face flushed with anger. "That's it, Jake," he snapped, his voice loud and furious. "You're done here." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. "What?" he breathed, shock and disbelief warring on his face. "I've had enough of your soft-hearted nonsense," Tom spat, crossing his arms. "You're not a fit for LaBelle. You're fired." The other salesmen, still inside, watched through the glass walls, their expressions a mix of pity and satisfaction. Jake felt his world crumble around him. Fired? Just like that? For what? For treating a man with basic respect. The injustice of it burned in his chest, but he knew arguing would be pointless. With a heavy heart, he nodded once, then turned and walked away, the weight of his failure pressing down on him with every step. The following weeks were a blur of rejections and setbacks. Jake applied for job after job, his confidence dwindling with each polite, "Sorry, we're not hiring right now." His savings dwindled rapidly, and soon he was forced to sell his car just to make rent. Nights were the worst. Alone in his tiny apartment, he replayed the events at La Belle over and over, wondering if he'd been naive to think that kindness could have a place in a world driven by profit and power. But despite his doubts, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. He knew he'd done the right thing, even if it had cost him everything. One particularly bleak evening, after another fruitless day of job searching, Jake found himself at a small diner, nursing a cup of coffee he could barely afford. As he stared blankly out the window, his thoughts spiraled deeper into despair. How had his life come to this? He'd started at La Belle full of hope and ambition, determined to build a future for himself. Now he was broke, jobless, and utterly alone. For a moment, he considered calling the number on Henry's card, but pride held him back. What could he possibly say? "Hey, remember me? I got fired for being nice to you. Can you help?" The idea seemed pathetic. Just as he was about to leave, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was his landlord, reminding him that rent was due in 3 days. Jake's stomach twisted painfully. He didn't have the money. With a sinking heart, he realized he was out of options. Reluctantly, he reached into his wallet and pulled out Henry's card. The paper was worn now, the ink slightly smudged from being handled so often. Taking a deep breath, he dialed the number, his fingers trembling. The phone rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" Jake froze, his mouth suddenly dry. What was he doing? Hi, Mr. Marsh," he stammered, feeling foolish. "I don't know if you remember me. I'm Jake Palmer, from the car dealership." There was a pause. Then Henry's voice came through, warm and welcoming. "Jake, of course I remember you," he said softly. "I was hoping you'd call." The kindness in his tone was like a balm to Jake's battered spirit. He blinked back sudden tears, swallowing the lump in his throat. I didn't want to bother you," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. Henry cut him off gently. "You're not bothering me, son. I gave you that card for a reason. Now, tell me what's going on." The words poured out of Jake in a rush, getting fired, struggling to find work, the looming threat of eviction. Henry listened patiently, never interrupting. When Jake finally finished, his chest felt hollow, as if he'd just laid bare every wound he'd tried to hide. There was silence on the other end. Then Henry spoke, his voice steady and calm. "Jake," he said quietly, "I'm going to help you. Meet me tomorrow morning at Café Deluxe downtown. We'll talk more then." Jake could barely process what was happening. Help him? Why? But before he could ask, Henry hung up, leaving Jake staring at his phone in stunned disbelief. The next morning, Jake arrived at Café Deluxe, a small, elegant bistro nestled in the heart of the business district. He spotted Henry immediately, sitting by the window in a crisp, tailored suit, a far cry from the humble man in plaid he'd met at the dealership. Henry stood as Jake approached, smiling warmly. "Jake," he greeted, shaking his hand firmly. "It's good to see you." Jake blinked, still struggling to reconcile this polished, confident figure with the unassuming customer he'd once served. "Mr. Marsh," he began hesitantly, but Henry waved him off. "Call me Henry," he insisted gently. "Now sit down. We have a lot to discuss." Jake sank into the chair opposite Henry, feeling a mix of confusion, hope, and apprehension. What could Henry possibly want with him? But before he could voice his doubts, Henry leaned forward, his gaze intent. "You know, Jake," he said softly, "I've been thinking about that day a lot. The way you treated me, that's rare. Most people judge others by their appearance, but you saw me as a person, not just a paycheck. That's a quality worth more than gold." Jake stared at him, speechless. What was Henry saying? Jake sat in stunned silence, Henry's words echoing in his mind. Worth more than gold? No one had ever spoken to him like that before, valuing him for something other than his ability to hit sales targets or meet quotas. He swallowed hard, struggling to process everything. "But I lost my job because of it," Jake murmured, his voice thick with lingering pain. "I'm broke, nearly homeless. How can that be worth anything?" Henry's eyes softened, filled with a deep understanding. "Sometimes, standing by your principles means facing losses in the short term," he said quietly. "But it's people like you, those who don't waver in the face of adversity, who build real wealth, the kind that can't be taken away." Jake blinked, his throat tightening. Real wealth. He'd never thought of it like that. To him, wealth had always been about money, status, and power, the very things he'd been striving for since he started at LaBelle Motors. But as he sat there, looking into Henry's calm, steady gaze, he realized that maybe there was more to it. Maybe true wealth was about staying true to yourself, even when the world seemed determined to beat you down. "You have a rare gift, Jake," Henry continued softly, "the courage to see people for who they really are, not just what they appear to be." Emotion welled up inside Jake, a mix of gratitude, relief, and something else he couldn't quite name. "But what good is that now?" he asked bitterly, his voice barely a whisper. "I have nothing, no job, no prospects. I'm at the end of my rope, Henry." Henry leaned back slightly, studying Jake with a thoughtful expression. "That's where you're wrong," he said firmly. "You have more than you think." Before Jake could respond, Henry reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black folder. He slid it across the table, his gaze never leaving Jake's face. "Open it." With trembling hands, Jake lifted the cover, his eyes widening as he read the words printed inside. It was a formal business contract, and not just any contract. This was an offer to buy LaBelle Motors. His heart pounded as he glanced up at Henry, his mind racing. What is this?" he stammered, his voice filled with shock. Henry smiled, his expression warm but serious. "It's exactly what it looks like," he replied. "I'm buying the dealership, and I want you to be the manager." Jake's mouth dropped open, his thoughts tumbling over each other in a chaotic jumble. "Me? But why?" "Because you're the only person I've met there who understands what real service means," Henry said simply. "You didn't treat me like an inconvenience or a waste of time. You treated me with respect, without knowing anything about who I was or what I could offer you in return." He paused, his gaze steady. "That's the kind of person I want running my business. Someone who sees beyond the surface, who values character over appearance. Someone who believes that every customer, no matter how they look, deserves to be treated with dignity." Jake's head spun. This couldn't be real. It was too incredible, too surreal. Just a few days ago, he'd been on the verge of losing everything, and now, this? "But what about the owners?" he managed, his voice tight with disbelief. "They'll never sell." Henry's smile turned wry. "Oh, they will," he said confidently. "They're already in over their heads financially. They just don't know it yet. A few more months and they'll be desperate. I'm just speeding up the process." The casual certainty in Henry's tone sent a shiver down Jake's spine. This man, he wasn't just a millionaire. He was a strategist, someone who saw 3 steps ahead of everyone else. "Jake," Henry said softly, drawing his attention back, "I'm not just offering you a job. I'm offering you a chance to prove that kindness and integrity can thrive in a cutthroat world. To show everyone that you don't have to compromise who you are to succeed." Jake's heart raced, a mix of fear and excitement surging through him. Could he really do this? Could he take on such a huge responsibility? Run a business that had once cast him aside like trash? Doubt clawed at him, but then he remembered the note Henry had given him all those months ago. "Kindness matters more than you think." Slowly, Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'll do it," he whispered, his voice fierce with determination. Henry's smile widened, approval shining in his eyes. "I knew you would," he said softly. "Now let's go show them what real leadership looks like." Jake stood on unsteady legs, the enormity of what he'd just agreed to starting to sink in. But beneath the fear, there was a spark of something else. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to turn everything around, to take the principles that had nearly broken him and use them to build something stronger. The next morning, they walked into LaBelle Motors together. The staff, busy tending to the few customers browsing the showroom, barely glanced at them at first. But when Tom spotted them, his face twisted in a mixture of shock and anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" he snapped, striding forward, his gaze fixed on Jake. "I told you you're fired. You have no business." He broke off as Henry stepped forward, his expression calm and authoritative. "Actually, Tom, he does," Henry interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet, commanding power. "I'm here to finalize the purchase of this dealership. Jake's going to be the new manager." The room went deathly silent. Every head turned toward them, eyes wide with disbelief. Tom looked like he'd been slapped. "What?" he stammered, his face paling. You can't be serious." But Henry just smiled, unruffled. "Oh, I'm very serious," he said smoothly. "And I suggest you start packing up your things, Tom. Your services are no longer needed." Jake's heart thundered in his chest as he watched Tom's expression shift from shock to fury, then to a sort of stunned resignation. The other salesmen were staring, their jaws practically on the floor. Whispers spread through the showroom like wildfire. Tom opened his mouth as if to argue, but then seemed to deflate. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stalked away, his shoulders hunched. Jake felt a strange, dizzying mix of emotions, triumph, disbelief, and a lingering sense of surrealness. Was this really happening? Henry placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "You did the right thing back then, Jake," he murmured quietly. "And now, you have the chance to show everyone just how powerful kindness can be." Jake swallowed hard, nodding slowly. He wasn't just taking over a dealership. He was standing up for every person who'd ever been underestimated, disrespected, or pushed aside. And he was going to prove, once and for all, that integrity was the greatest wealth of all. Jake stood at the center of the dealership's showroom, feeling the weight of every eye on him. He had walked into LaBelle Motors just a few months ago as a humble, eager-to-please salesman. Now, he was the new manager, with the power to shape the very place that had once dismissed him. The change felt almost unreal, but there was no time for self-doubt. As he glanced around, meeting the shocked gazes of his former colleagues, a sense of purpose swelled within him. This was his chance to transform LaBelle, to create a space where everyone, whether wearing a suit or tattered jeans, was treated with respect. The first order of business was addressing the team. With Henry by his side, Jake called the staff together. Faces that had once looked down on him now gazed back with wary curiosity and, in some cases, open hostility. Rick, in particular, stood off to the side, arms crossed, a sneer tugging at his lips. Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I know this is a shock for many of you," he began, his voice steady. "And I'm not here to pretend like I haven't been where you are, struggling to close deals, fighting for commissions, and dealing with difficult times. But I am here to tell you that things are going to change." A ripple of murmurs spread through the group, but Jake pressed on. "From now on, this dealership will be known not just for its luxury cars, but for the way we treat people," he continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "No more judging customers based on their clothes or their appearance. No more pushing people out the door because they don't look like they belong." His eyes locked onto Rick's. "Everyone who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." Rick's sneer deepened, but he didn't say anything. Jake swallowed hard, pushing back his nerves. He had to set the tone now, or he'd lose the team before he even started. Some of you might not agree, Jake acknowledged, his tone firm. And that's fine. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for an open mind and a willingness to change. He paused, letting his words sink in. But if you can't get on board with this new direction, if you think it's a waste of time, then maybe this isn't the right place for you anymore. The room fell silent, tension hanging thick in the air. Jake's heart pounded, but he stood his ground, meeting each gaze steadily. Finally, Henry stepped forward, his presence calm and reassuring. Jake's right, he said quietly. Kindness and integrity are the new standards here, and I'll be backing him every step of the way. The murmurs started again, but this time there was a different energy in the room, a mixture of surprise, intrigue, and for a few, cautious hope. Jake knew he'd made his stance clear, but the real work was only beginning. Over the next few days, he threw himself into transforming the dealership's culture. He held training sessions, encouraging the team to see beyond the surface and approach every customer with genuine interest. He established new policies, rewarding employees not just for sales, but for customer satisfaction and community involvement. It wasn't easy. There was resistance, especially from the old guard like Rick, who openly mocked the changes at every opportunity. But slowly, things began to shift. Jake made a point to be on the floor every day, leading by example. He took the time to greet each customer personally, whether they were wearing designer suits or faded t-shirts. He shared stories of his own struggles, his journey from being a rejected employee to manager, and how Henry's unexpected kindness had turned his life around. People started to notice. Word spread that LaBelle Motors was under new management, and with it came a different kind of clientele. People who had felt unwelcome before, now stepping through the doors with cautious curiosity. One day, an elderly man shuffled into the dealership, his clothes simple, his shoes worn. Jake saw the looks some of the salesmen exchanged, but before anyone could say anything, he walked over and introduced himself. "Welcome to LaBelle Motors. I'm Jake Palmer, the manager here," he said warmly, extending his hand. The old man blinked, clearly startled. You're the manager?" he stammered, glancing around nervously. "Yes, sir," Jake replied with a smile. "What can I do for you today?" The man hesitated, then pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "I'm looking for a reliable car," he murmured. "I saved up for a long time, and I'm hoping I can find something that'll last." Jake's heart tightened. This man reminded him so much of himself, someone who'd fought hard for every penny, determined to make the most of what little he had. Ignoring the skeptical glances from the other salesmen, Jake spent over an hour showing the man different models, explaining the pros and cons of each, and answering every question with patience and respect. When they finally settled on a modest sedan, the man's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I was so afraid you'd turn me away." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. "We'd never do that," he said softly. "Every customer matters here." That sale, a modest one by LaBelle's usual standards, marked a turning point. Word spread like wildfire. LaBelle Motors was no longer just for the rich and powerful. It was a place where anyone could walk in and be treated like royalty. Slowly but surely, the dealership's reputation began to change. And with it, sales soared. People who had never set foot in the showroom before now came in droves, drawn by the stories of Jake's kindness and the dealership's commitment to treating everyone with respect. Even Henry, who had stepped back to let Jake lead, was amazed at the transformation. Rick, however, remained a thorn in Jake's side. He resisted every change, complaining loudly to anyone who would listen. "This place is going to hell," he muttered one afternoon, glaring at Jake from across the room. "We're not a charity. We sell high-end cars, not budget junk." Jake met his gaze evenly. "We sell cars to people, Rick, all kinds of people. And if you can't get behind that, maybe it's time you moved on." Rick scoffed, but Jake didn't back down. He knew Rick was waiting for him to fail, to prove that kindness had no place in business. But Jake wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. In the end, it was the customers who decided. One by one they came in, people who had been turned away, dismissed, or ignored by other dealerships. Each time, Jake welcomed them with open arms, making sure they left not just with a car, but with a sense of being truly valued. The transformation wasn't just about sales, it was about trust, community, and respect, and the numbers reflected it. Profits soared, and LaBelle Motors soon became the top-performing dealership in the region. Even the old owners, who had been skeptical of Henry's decision, couldn't deny the results. For Jake, it wasn't just a victory, it was vindication. He'd set out to prove that integrity and kindness could succeed where greed and arrogance had failed. And as he looked around the bustling showroom, filled with happy customers and a team that had finally embraced his vision, he knew he'd done exactly that. He'd turned LaBelle Motors into more than just a business. He'd turned it into a place where everyone, no matter their background, wealth, or status, was welcome. The dealership continued to thrive under Jake's leadership, and LaBelle Motors was now unrecognizable from the elitist showroom it once was. Customers from all walks of life streamed in, knowing they would be treated with dignity and respect, no matter what. The young man who had once been ridiculed for serving a humble stranger was now celebrated for his vision and integrity. But even with the dealership's newfound success, Jake never let it go to his head. He remained grounded, making sure to personally greet each visitor, share a kind word with his team, and remind them of the values that had brought them all this way. But as time passed, there was still one person Jake hadn't seen again: Henry. One quiet afternoon, as Jake was reviewing the dealership's latest performance reports, he received a call. "Jake, it's Henry," came the familiar voice on the other end. Jake's heart lifted instantly. "Henry, it's been a while," he replied warmly, leaning back in his chair. "How have you been?" There was a pause, and then Henry chuckled softly. "I've been keeping an eye on you, son. You've done wonders with the place." Pride swelled in Jake's chest, but before he could respond, Henry's tone turned more serious. "I'm calling because it's time for me to step back completely. The dealership is yours now, officially." Jake froze, his mind reeling. "Wait, what? You're giving it to me?" he stammered, his voice tight with shock. "Henry, I don't know what to say." But Henry interrupted gently. "You earned this, Jake. More than that, you've made it something I never could. You've turned LaBelle Motors into a beacon of hope and respect. That's something worth far more than any business deal." Emotion surged through Jake, a fierce mix of gratitude, disbelief, and humility. He blinked rapidly, trying to keep his composure. "Henry, I thank you. I'll make sure it stays that way. I promise." With the final ownership papers signed and the business fully transferred, Jake felt an even deeper sense of responsibility settle on his shoulders. But rather than overwhelm him, it fueled his determination. He threw himself into new projects, expanding the dealership's reach and implementing programs to give back to the community. He hired more employees from diverse backgrounds, focusing on those who, like him, had been underestimated or overlooked. He even established a scholarship fund for aspiring young business people, offering them a chance to build a future based on principles of respect and integrity. One evening, as Jake was closing up for the day, a familiar figure walked through the door. It was Rick. His hair was grayer, his face lined with age, but the hard, defiant glint in his eyes was the same. "So," Rick drawled, looking around the bustling showroom, "I see you've turned this place into a charity after all." Jake straightened, meeting Rick's gaze calmly. "I turned it into a place where everyone is welcome," he replied quietly, "and it's doing better than ever." Rick scoffed, shaking his head. You got lucky, that's all. People like you're too soft for this world. Jake smiled faintly, remembering Henry's words all those months ago. Maybe, he conceded. But I'd rather be soft and successful on my own terms than hard and alone. There was a long silence as they stared at each other, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Rick looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly. I came to ask if you were hiring, he muttered, almost too quietly to hear. Jake's eyes widened in surprise. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Then, he took a deep breath, letting go of the old bitterness. We are, he said softly, if you're willing to work with our new values. Rick blinked, clearly caught off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Finally, he nodded once, stiffly. I can do that, he muttered, his voice gruff. Jake smiled, feeling a surprising sense of peace. Good. Welcome back, Rick. The older man just grunted, but there was something softer in his expression, a tiny spark of respect buried deep. As Rick walked away to fill out the paperwork, Jake couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd all come. It wasn't just about success or proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about creating a place where people could change, grow, and find redemption. Months passed, and the dealership flourished under Jake's compassionate leadership. The community rallied around LaBelle Motors, not just as a business, but as a symbol of what could happen when you built something on principles of kindness and integrity. Customers returned time and again, not just to buy cars, but to be a part of something bigger, a place where respect and generosity were woven into every interaction. Jake, now a respected figure in the industry, was frequently invited to speak at business conferences and community events, sharing his story of perseverance and the unexpected power of kindness. But even as he stood on stages and accepted accolades, Jake never forgot where it all began, with a single act of kindness toward a humble man in worn clothes. He kept Henry's card in his wallet. The ink faded now, but the message still clear. Kindness matters more than you think. It served as a reminder of the man who had seen something in him that no one else had. And every time he looked at it, he felt a surge of gratitude, not just for Henry's generosity, but for the opportunity to live out those words every single day. One sunny afternoon, as Jake was locking up the dealership, he spotted a familiar figure standing by the entrance. Henry. But this time, he wasn't alone. A small group of children clustered around him, their eyes wide with excitement as he pointed out the different cars. Jake's heart swelled as he walked over, grinning. "Henry!" he called out, his voice filled with joy. The older man turned, a smile spreading across his face. "Jake," he greeted warmly, pulling him into a hug. "I thought I'd stop by and see what you've done with the place." Jake laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You gave me this place, Henry, everything I've built. It's because of you." Henry's eyes twinkled with pride. "No, Jake," he murmured softly, "it's because of who you are." The words, simple yet profound, wrapped around Jake like a warm embrace. As he stood there, surrounded by the hum of life and laughter, he realized that the true wealth Henry had given him wasn't the dealership or the position. It was the chance to create a legacy of kindness, to change lives and build a place where people felt valued. And in that moment, Jake knew, with every fiber of his being, that this was the greatest success he could ever achieve. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about how appearances can deceive and how kindness always makes a difference, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. There are so many more stories that will challenge your perspective, inspire you, and maybe even change the way you see the world. Stay tuned for more.